Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 298. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Free from 1970, Fire and Water. This is a reissue on A&M. It's an American reissue from about 1981. So Free are one of the great underappreciated bands of the rock era. They're basically known for one hit, All Right Now, and their work is largely overshadowed by their lead singer Paul Rodgers' work later on with Bad Company, but their catalog contains great riches. In my opinion, this record is better than any single Bad Company release. Yes, it's a record with one monster hit, but the rest of the songs in the record come very close to approaching that level and are consistently good, such that it is one of those records which is just great to listen to all the way through. The music is played slowly, but even the ballads rock hard, and it's not so much blues rock as it is boogie rock slowed down, often played in a minor key, and there's a kind of a wistful feeling to a lot of the music. The record is beautifully produced, engineered by Roy Thomas Baker. The sound is incredible, like the band is right there in the room. The star turns, of course, are Paul Kossoff's perfect minimalist guitar and Paul Rodgers' incredible vocals, which I think reach an early peak on this record. But it's more than that. It's a band effort. It's a crystallization of all of the talents of this band. But sadly, that success would soon vaporize. As their drummer Simon Kirke says, in the summer of 1970, with this record, they had the whole world in the palm of their hands, but they let it blow away. While I've reviewed a Free record before in this channel, I've never really delved deeply into the history of the band. And the story of the band basically starts with Paul Rodgers, who is part of the pantheon of great rock singers from the northeast of England. And Rodgers in 1967 was living in Middlesbrough. He was playing bass and then later was the vocalist for a band variously called the Roadrunners and then later on the Wallflowers. The Wallflowers, who also included the future Whitesnake guitarist Mickey Moody, had basically outgrown the Northeast. They were moving down to London in 1967 to try their luck in the big time. They packed all their kit into a van and headed down south, only they didn't get there because the van broke down. And such was a commitment within the band to this project, or lack thereof, that in the time it took to get the van towed, most of the members had hitchhiked back up north. Paul Rodgers, however, made the fateful decision to cross the road and hitchhike south instead. He ends up in London, manages somehow to find a flat and survive, starts his own blues cover band, a band called Brown Sugar, and they begin to play the pub circuit. Meanwhile, across town in London, there's another teenage blues band called Black Cat Bones, who have a star guitarist, Paul Kossoff. In early '68, Kossoff had brought a new drummer into Black Cat Bones, a guy called Simon Kirke. Kossoff then goes to a gig by Rodgers' group Brown Sugar, and he's hugely impressed. And he approaches Rodgers after the gig and says, "Look, come and join my group instead." And Rodgers is not that keen because he doesn't want to wind up his own band to join somebody else's project. And he tells Kossoff this. So they decide then and there they're going to form their own band. Kossoff suggests they bring in Simon Kirke on drums from Black Cat Bones, which leaves them needing a bass player. And the bass player they'd find, Andy Fraser, had at that point just joined John Mayall's Bluesbreakers at the age of 15, having been recommended by Alexis Corner, the great kingmaker of the British blues scene, who was the father of a schoolmate of Andy Fraser's, a girl called Sappho Corner. Fraser had only been with the Bluesbreakers for 6 weeks when he leaves and joins up with Kossoff, Rodgers, and Kirke. Now, you can read in some histories that they found Fraser through an ad, but Fraser and Paul Kossoff actually knew each other before because Fraser, as I mentioned, was a friend of Alexis Corner's daughter Sappho, and Sappho's boyfriend, here and there, had been Paul Kossoff. Kossoff knew that Fraser had talent, and he persuades him to join his and Rodgers' as yet unnamed group, which might have seemed like a bit of a step down, but there were other things which were probably more appealing, like the fact that nobody in Free was over 18 years of age, whereas John Mayall was 36 at the time, so his band was very much an old man's band. At Alexis Corner's suggestion, they called themselves Free, and they were quickly signed to Chris Blackwell's Island Records. Blackwell then said, "Why don't you guys change your name to something more marketable?" And his suggestion was Heavy Metal Kids, which is a terrible name. Thankfully, and showing a lot of chutzpah as teenagers standing up to a label boss, the band said no, they were going to be Free. Now with the record deal, they released 2 albums in fairly quick succession in the spring and fall of 1969, both of which have achieved a degree of critical admiration retrospectively, particularly the debut, Tons of Sobs, which has some great tunes on it. But neither of those records troubled the charts, and they really sound like records which, for all their strengths, are uneven and were made, as they were, by teenagers. Talented teenagers, yes, but teenagers nonetheless. But all the while in 1969, Free were gigging live as a band, including a tour of the US. And they were absorbing new influences, and slowly but surely their own unique identity as a band was emerging. As 1970 dawned, they entered the studio for the 3rd time in less than a year, but this time the results would be spectacular. This record was made in several different sessions in the first half of 1970. It's self-produced with a lot of assistance from then unknown engineer Roy Thomas Baker, who deserves, I think, a lot of credit because this record is a perfect combination of open space and intimacy. This record is also where the songwriting partnership of Rogers and Fraser would come into its own. They had co-written most of the previous record, the self-titled Free, which contains a number of, I think, underappreciated tracks like Broad Daylight or I'll Be Creepin'. But by and large, that track list only contains the seeds of what would really flourish on this record. Fraser and Rogers got heavily into writing the tracks for this record in the fall of 1969, aided in part by a byproduct of a medical situation where Rogers was laid up for a few weeks with a bad case of the clap. Anyway, there he was at home. Fraser would come over, and one of the first tracks they worked up that fall was the title track, Fire and Water, which is true to their slow, bluesy sound, but at the same time transcended everything that had gone before and really became something which played to the strengths of all of the band. What they also perfected on these songs would become a free trademark, which is the use of white space in the music to create a sense of anticipation and excitement in the listener. Kossoff is much more selective in what he plays, and often you just have the rhythm section bridging different musical passages. Other songs of similar quality began to follow in a rush, and they went to the studio in January 1970, initially at Trident, but they also had to use Island Studios in Notting Hill because they were competing for studio space with George Harrison and Zeppelin at the same time. The big hit on the record, All Right Now, differs from most of the rest of the songs in that it's got a faster tempo, and it was written in about 15 minutes following a gig at Durham University Students' Union. Most of their songs had a slow, bluesy tempo, which people loved, but did not give much of a sense of climax at the end of the gig. So, frustrated by this, they came off stage, and in 15 minutes they wrote what was intended to be and what became a real crowd-pleasing, foot-stomping curtain closer. The single version of that song is a minute and 14 seconds shorter than the album version, thanks to Blackwell cutting it down over the objections of the band, but they had to concede he was right because it goes to number 2 in the UK and number 4 in the US. And from there, they were on their way and things should only have gotten better. But that's not how it worked out. They did make a triumphant appearance at the Isle of Wight Festival that summer alongside some real heavyweights like The Who and Jimi Hendrix. But then personality differences, the pressures of following up a global smash hit on a young band, and ultimately Paul Kossoff's all-consuming drug habit soon killed off one of the most talented bands in rock history, spent as a creative force within a year. Side 1 begins with the title track, Fire and Water, which is a perfect, slow, heavy rock song which shows off, as frankly does the whole album, Paul Rogers' incredible strengths as a singer. In fact, in the absence of All Right Now, this song would actually probably be a lot better known, and it's followed up by an equally satisfying song, Oh I Wept. This is another slow, heavy classic, and I really dig the minimal choices that Kossoff makes. Then we have Remember, another slow, heavy classic, and sure, these are all kind of on a theme, which not everybody is into, but they're all incredibly good songs in their own right, and another amazing performance here by Kossoff. The final track on side 1 is Heavy Load, which is the first and maybe the only true ballad on the record. This has Rogers on piano and another great vocal from him. Side 2 starts with Mr. Big, which is built around an E7 chord from Kossoff. It begins with what I think is one of the most perfectly recorded drum sounds ever, but the real standout here, amongst other great performances, is the bass work from Andy Fraser. Not just his incredible work during the Freakout section, but the neck slides that he does during the verses are also spectacular. Don't Say You Love Me is next. It's the bluesiest song on the record. I think I lied. I said there was only one ballad. This is the second proper ballad on the record. This could easily have been an Etta James song, and on here, Rogers' voice and phrasing on the bridge is peak level. The final track is, of course, the big hit All Right Now, about which I'll simply say it encapsulates everything which is good and simple and beautiful about rock and roll. While this may seem like a bit of an odd comparison, I find on this record that Free achieves what Miles Davis did in the 50s and what Joy Division would do later in the 70s by stripping away all kinds of extraneous noise and focusing on the use of silence as an instrument. While it's true the music on here largely moves at a deliberate pace, paradoxically, it rocks as hard as anything released in this era. The other 6 tracks in this record have unjustifiably long been overshadowed by the big hit, and if they're all kind of variations on a theme, it's an amazing theme. This is a record which no classic rock collection should ever be without. For me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.